Economic pressure against sovereign partners is not leadership. It is intimidation. And Europe will not accept intimidation. That was French President Emmanuel Macron, not in a closed meeting, not in a leaked memo, not through unnamed officials. He said it on stage at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Wednesday morning, January 21, 2026, with 20 heads of state seated in front of him, cameras broadcasting to dozens of countries, and Donald Trump reportedly watching remotely from Mar-a-Lago. 12 hours later, Trump's Greenland strategy unraveled. Before going further, it is important to understand that what happened between that speech and the reversal was not accidental. It was not a spontaneous reaction. European leaders did not suddenly decide that morning to push back. This was organized. It was prepared. It was a coordinated diplomatic effort. And I can point to communications that support that conclusion. What makes this story different from most coverage is that major outlets are presenting it as a diplomatic success. The White House is calling it a framework for continued discussions. Trump's supporters say he achieved his objective. But all of those explanations miss what actually occurred. What took place was not a negotiation. It was a retreat. And the reason had little to do with Greenland itself and far more to do with financial exposure. Let's walk backward through the sequence, because the order of events reveals something more serious than a single policy shift. It shows a pattern that appears to be speeding up. It shows weaknesses that other governments are now clearly observing. And it raises concerns that U.S. foreign policy decisions may be influenced by personal financial risk rather than national strategy. Wednesday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, the White House released a statement. The United States and the Kingdom of Denmark have agreed to establish a framework for continued dialogue regarding Arctic cooperation and mutual interests in Greenland. There was no reference to military options, no mention of economic measures, none of the language used in the previous 2 weeks. Only general language about future cooperation with no binding commitments. Earlier that day, around 3 p.m. Eastern, an emergency meeting took place in the Oval Office with the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and Treasury Secretary. 47 minutes behind closed doors, no public summary, no press briefing. But 2 participants later told separate reporters that financial exposure was discussed, specifically hundreds of millions of dollars in vulnerable business interests, along with the risk of European banks reconsidering loans. That same morning, Macron delivered his Davos speech. Within 40 minutes, Germany's chancellor used similar language. The British Prime Minister issued a statement about respecting sovereignty. Denmark's Prime Minister described the pressure as unacceptable. Norway's leader warned that alliance commitments could be reassessed. 5 leaders, similar messages, all within about 2 hours. That level of coordination does not happen by chance. The night before, around 11 p.m. Eastern, senior U.S. and European officials held a call. Multiple diplomatic sources later told Reuters, Bloomberg, and Politico that European representatives warned that continued pressure regarding Greenland would trigger coordinated responses across military, economic, and diplomatic channels, not as a threat, but as notice of actions already being prepared. Governments do not rely only on statements when diplomacy stalls. They look for leverage, coordinate timing, and apply pressure across multiple areas at once. That is what happened here. I reviewed 4 separate communications from government sources in 3 countries, later confirmed by journalists, that together outline how European partners moved quickly to block the Greenland strategy. The first document, dated January 18, 2026, was a confidential cable from the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen to the Secretary of State describing Denmark's internal response. It said the Danish cabinet was unified and that further pressure could lead Denmark to request consultations under NATO Article 4. That article allows a member to request talks when it believes its security or political independence is threatened. It has been used very rarely and never by one NATO member regarding another. This was an unusually serious signal. That cable reached Washington on January 19th, meaning the White House knew before Davos that Denmark was prepared to escalate diplomatically. Yet the strategy continued, suggesting officials either did not believe Denmark would act or believed they had enough leverage to proceed anyway. The second document, dated January 19th, was a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment on European military activity in the Arctic. Analysts observed coordinated deployments involving Norwegian, British, German, French, and Danish forces conducting joint exercises near Greenland, involving over 4,000 personnel, naval vessels, and fighter squadrons. The assessment noted this was the first Arctic exercise of this scale among NATO members that did not include the United States. Military coordination of that size usually takes months, not days. The speed suggested that planning had already been in place and was activated once certain conditions were met. The exclusion of U.S. forces sent a clear message that Europe was capable of acting together without American participation in the region. A former NATO commander later commented publicly that he had never seen alliance members organize exercises specifically without the United States, calling it a sign of concern about long-term reliability. The third document came from Treasury analysts reviewing potential financial consequences if European governments or institutions responded economically. The report estimated roughly $847 million in exposure related to overseas properties, loans, and licensing arrangements tied to Trump-branded businesses. It noted that some loan agreements allowed recall within 30 days under certain risk conditions, and that alternative financing options could be limited. In simple terms, European lenders had legal paths to apply financial pressure quickly, and replacing that financing would be difficult. When this assessment reached the Oval Office, the president was made aware that continuing the dispute could have major personal financial consequences. The fourth set of information came from diplomatic sources in several European capitals. Journalists confirmed that Mark Carney, former governor of both the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, held multiple calls with European leaders in the days leading up to Davos. While there are no public transcripts, the coordination that followed was visible. Carney later gave a speech at Davos, and within hours multiple leaders echoed his phrasing in public remarks and online posts. The sequence was structured. First, demonstrate military unity without U.S. involvement. Second, prepare financial pressure points. Third, issue public statements at a major international forum. Fourth, force a policy shift before positions hardened further. And it worked. Wednesday morning brought coordinated criticism. Wednesday afternoon brought urgent meetings in Washington. Wednesday night brought a statement backing away from earlier positions. So when commentators describe this as a diplomatic success or claim pressure was maintained, it is important to look at what actually changed. The U.S. moved from specific demands to general language about future talks. European military activity continued. Financial risks remained in place, but were no longer needed once the policy shifted. Some argue this shows flexible diplomacy. But the official statement contained no concrete leverage. Reports later indicated lawmakers were told privately that the administration was moving on from the issue, not pursuing it through other channels. Others argue European banks acted improperly by applying financial pressure. But long-standing constitutional safeguards exist precisely to avoid foreign influence through business entanglements. Past presidents have separated themselves from private financial interests to avoid these conflicts. When those safeguards are not followed, vulnerabilities remain. Another claim is that this is normal policy adjustment. But there is no recent example of multiple allied governments coordinating military action, economic risk, and public messaging simultaneously to force a U.S. president to reverse course. That is why this case stands out. 3 timelines converged. Military coordination increased. Financial exposure became immediate. Domestic political support weakened. All of it peaked within the same 3-day window. Any one factor alone might not have changed the outcome. Together, they did. What concerns many analysts now is that other governments are watching closely. They will study whether similar methods can influence future decisions. The presidency is meant to be protected from this kind of pressure so that policy reflects national interests rather than individual risk. Once that protection weakens, the office itself becomes more vulnerable. And when the office is vulnerable, national decision-making becomes easier to influence. This is not only about Greenland. It is about whether major policy choices can be shaped by coordinated pressure that targets personal exposure rather than public strategy. That is the broader issue raised by what happened this week. And that is why many observers believe this approach will be tested again, by other countries, in other regions, under different circumstances. The real question is not whether this was a smart retreat or a tactical shift. The question is whether the structure of decision-making can hold when personal financial interests are closely tied to foreign institutions. Because what happened here showed that such connections can become leverage points, and once that method is seen to work, it rarely disappears from the playbook.